Berlin, January 16, 1945. 12 meters below the manicured gardens of the Reich Chancellery, a steel door swings shut with a heavy metallic clunk, roughly the sound of a bank vault sealing for the night. Above ground, the German capital still functions, buses run, shops open their shutters, people queue for bread. But below, in a warren of concrete rooms lit by bare bulbs, a war is being run from a desk barely large enough for a map of Europe. Adolf Hitler has just moved into the Vorbunker, the upper level of what will become known to history as the Führerbunker. He will not leave this compound alive. The air down here is already thick, damp with condensation, tinged with the diesel fumes of a generator working harder than its designers ever intended. A telephone rings in a side room. Another situation report. Another retreat dressed up in the language of strategic realignment. Hitler paces a corridor barely 2 meters wide, past a rack of maps that grow more fictional by the week, divisions marked in red and blue that no longer exist, armies conjured from nothing but desperation and denial. This is not a story about a single bunker. It is a story about what happens when a regime built on spectacle, on rallies of 100,000 men, on newsreels and torchlight and thunderous oratory, is forced underground, literally and psychologically, into a hole in the earth. The Führerbunker was never meant to be a permanent residence. It was meant to be a temporary shelter for a leader who intended, at least in the beginning, to win. By the time Hitler took up residence there in earnest, it had become something else entirely. A tomb he had built for himself years before he knew he would need one, and a stage for the final act of the Third Reich. Understanding this place, its engineering, its purpose, its final days, is to understand how an empire that once stretched from the Atlantic to the Volga collapsed into a space smaller than a modest family home. The story of why Berlin needed a bunker at all begins not in 1945, but in 1936, with a problem that had nothing to do with ground troops or tank divisions and everything to do with the sky. Aerial bombardment had been a theoretical horror throughout the interwar years, discussed by strategists and feared by civilians who had seen newsreel footage of Guernica reduced to rubble in 1937. German planners understood, with a clarity that unsettled even the most confident Nazi officials, that any future war would bring bombs to Berlin itself. The question was not whether the capital would be struck. It was how the machinery of government, and the man at its center, would survive when it was. Existing shelters were hopelessly inadequate for this task. Berlin, like most European capitals, had cellars and basements pressed into service as air raid shelters, spaces designed to protect against blast and shrapnel from artillery, not from 1,000-kilogram bombs dropped from 4-engine-heavy bombers flying at altitude. As the war progressed and Allied bombing campaigns intensified from 1940 onwards, the inadequacy became brutally apparent. The Royal Air Force and later the United States Army Air Forces were developing bombs of extraordinary destructive power, and by 1943 raids on Berlin were routinely dropping munitions capable of penetrating several stories of conventional masonry construction. A cellar, reinforced with timber props, offered no meaningful protection against this kind of ordnance. The scale of the bombing campaign made the problem impossible to ignore. Between 1940 and 1945, Berlin endured over 360 air raids, and by the war's final year, the Royal Air Force alone was capable of delivering raids involving more than 1,000 bombers in a single night. The cumulative tonnage dropped on the city ran into the tens of thousands, and entire districts were reduced to featureless fields of rubble. For a regime whose command structure depended on centralized, personal authority radiating from Hitler himself, the loss of that single figure to an air raid would have been catastrophic, arguably more catastrophic than the loss of an entire army group. The challenge, then, was not simply architectural, it was existential. How do you protect one man, and the apparatus of command around him, against a weapon system explicitly designed to flatten cities? The answer, as it so often did in Nazi Germany, came from a combination of engineering ambition and slave labor, organized chaos, and an almost obsessive faith in concrete as a solution to every strategic problem. The man most closely associated with the bunker's design was not a household name, and deliberately so. The Reich Chancellery's underground complex was developed under the supervision of architects working within Albert Speer's General Building Inspectorate, though Speer himself, ever careful in his post-war testimony, downplayed his direct involvement in the Führerbunker specifically, distinguishing it from the grander architectural fantasies he designed for Hitler elsewhere in Berlin. The bunker itself was constructed in two principal phases. The first, the Vorbunker, was built in 1936 as a relatively modest air raid shelter beneath the old Reich Chancellery garden, its walls 1.5 meters thick, sufficient for the threats then anticipated. By 1943, with the bombing campaign intensifying and the strategic picture darkening, construction began on a second, deeper structure directly beneath the first, connected by a stairwell and a heavy door. This lower level, the Führerbunker proper, was completed in its essential form by early 1945, though work continued almost until the moment Hitler himself moved in permanently. The engineering was, by the standards of civilian construction, extraordinary. The roof of the lower bunker was constructed from reinforced concrete up to 4 meters thick in places, a slab of material roughly the density and mass of a small apartment block compressed into a single ceiling. The walls, similarly, ran to nearly 2 meters of reinforced concrete in the most critical sections. To put this in perspective, a typical domestic wall might be 20 to 30 centimeters thick. This was concrete on a scale usually reserved for dams and fortifications, poured in successive layers around a dense lattice of steel reinforcement bar, a technique borrowed directly from the construction of Germany's Atlantic Wall defenses and the vast flak towers being erected in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna during the same period. The complex itself was compact, almost claustrophobically so, given the scale of the war being directed from within it. The lower bunker comprised roughly 20 rooms arranged around a central corridor, encompassing living quarters for Hitler and Eva Braun, a map room and conference space where the increasingly fantastical military briefings took place, quarters for Joseph and Magda Goebbels and their 6 children, a small kitchen, and cramped accommodation for adjutants, secretaries, and guards. Ventilation was provided by a diesel-powered system that also generated electricity, its engine housed in a separate room whose steady, grinding hum became the constant background noise of life underground. Water came from a well sunk beside the complex, since Berlin's main supply had become dangerously unreliable under sustained bombing. Sanitation was primitive by any standard, let alone one befitting a head of state, and those who lived there in the final weeks would later describe the air as perpetually stale, thick with cigarette smoke, damp concrete, and the ever-present tang of diesel exhaust, a smell one former secretary compared to sitting inside a submarine that never surfaced. Construction relied heavily on forced and slave labor, a detail the regime's own propaganda naturally omitted. Concrete of this volume and specification required constant supervision and enormous manpower to pour and cure correctly, particularly under wartime conditions where cement quality was inconsistent and skilled labor increasingly scarce as German men were conscripted to the front. Exact figures for the workforce involved remain difficult to establish with certainty. Records from this period are fragmentary, and some were deliberately destroyed. But historians generally agree that forced laborers, including prisoners from concentration camps and foreign workers compelled into service, made up a significant portion of those who built the very structure intended to shelter the man responsible for their imprisonment. The furnishing and internal fit-out of the bunker tell their own story about the priorities of a regime in decline. Despite the desperate material shortages afflicting almost every other part of German wartime industry by 1944, the Führerbunker's interior received furniture, carpets, and fittings salvaged or specially manufactured to a standard well above what ordinary Berliners could hope for. Hitler's study contained a modest desk, a portrait of Frederick the Great on the wall, and little else, a deliberate austerity that contrasted sharply with the grandiose architectural fantasies Speer had once designed for a post-war Berlin renamed Germania. That contrast is itself telling. The man who had commissioned triumphal arches and domed halls large enough to generate their own weather now worked from a room barely large enough to pace in, a shrinking of ambition mirrored precisely in the shrinking of physical space available to him. Electricity, when the main generator faltered, could be supplemented from a secondary battery bank, though power cuts became increasingly common in the final fortnight as fuel supplies for the diesel engine dwindled along with almost everything else in the surrounded city above. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. By the final months of the war, the Führerbunker had ceased to be merely a shelter and had become the operational headquarters of what remained of the Nazi state. From January 1945 onwards, Hitler conducted his daily military conferences here, a ritual that grew steadily more detached from reality as the weeks passed. Generals would descend the narrow staircase to report on divisions that existed only on paper, formations that had been destroyed weeks earlier, or that had simply melted away through desertion and collapse. Survivors' accounts, including those of Secretaries Traudl Junge and Gerda Christian, describe a leader whose hands trembled uncontrollably, whose moods swung between icy calculation and screaming rage, and who nonetheless continued to move colored pins across a map as though the war remained winnable. The psychological atmosphere within the bunker in its final weeks has been documented more thoroughly than perhaps any other aspect of its history, thanks to the survival of several key witnesses who later gave detailed testimony. What emerges is a portrait of institutional collapse compressed into a physical space of perhaps 300 square meters, a court in miniature, still observing rituals of deference and hierarchy even as Soviet artillery shells began landing in the Chancellery garden directly above. By late April 1945, the sound of that shelling was constant, a dull, percussive thud that shook dust from the concrete ceiling and rattled the light bulbs, an unmistakable signal that the front line had arrived at the doorstep of the Reich's command center. Daily life within these confines took on a strange, almost domestic rhythm despite the catastrophe unfolding above. Meals were still served at set times. Hitler's personal cook, Constanze Manziarli, continued preparing his customary vegetarian dishes even as artillery fire grew close enough to be felt through the floor. Magda Goebbels, having moved into the bunker with her husband and their 6 children in the final week of April, maintained a semblance of ordinary parenting, reading stories, enforcing bedtimes, even as she prepared, with a calculation that still unsettles historians today, to end all 6 young lives rather than let them live in a world without National Socialism. Junge later recalled the strange incongruity of children's laughter echoing down a corridor built to survive bombing raids, a detail that captures, perhaps better than any statistic, the moral collapse taking place within those walls. Birthday celebrations were still marked. Hitler's 56th birthday, on April 20, 1945, was observed with a small gathering and congratulations from the dwindling circle of loyalists still willing to descend the staircase, even as Soviet forces closed the final ring around the city above. It is worth pausing here to compare this structure with what other combatant nations built for their own leadership, because the contrast is genuinely revealing. The Germans were not alone in constructing deep shelters for wartime government, but the Führerbunker's design philosophy differed markedly from Allied equivalents. Winston Churchill's cabinet war rooms in Whitehall, though heavily reinforced, were considerably shallower and relied more on their central London location's dense surrounding infrastructure for protection than on the sheer mass of concrete the Germans favored. The Americans, never facing direct bombardment of Washington, had no equivalent structure at all for their own head of state, a reflection of simple geographic fortune rather than any difference in engineering philosophy. Perhaps the closest comparison lies within Germany itself, in the network of flak towers built in Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, structures whose walls and roofs rivaled the Führerbunker in sheer mass, though these were designed as anti-aircraft gun platforms and public shelters rather than command centers. The Zoo Flak Tower in Berlin, for instance, could reportedly shelter tens of thousands of civilians behind walls over 2 meters thick, and its construction shared engineers and techniques with the Chancellery bunker complex. What set the Führerbunker apart was not its scale, which was in fact modest compared to these public structures, but its purpose. A shelter built not for the many, but explicitly for the one man the regime considered irreplaceable, an architectural expression of the Führerprinzip itself, the principle that all authority flowed from and depended upon a single individual. Stalin, by comparison, relied on a network of Moscow metro stations and purpose-built shelters that, whilst extensive, never approached the concrete density of the Berlin structures, largely because Soviet planners judged, correctly as it turned out, that the Luftwaffe would never mount a bombing campaign against Moscow on anything close to the scale the Western Allies eventually directed at Berlin. This asymmetry reveals something important about how each combatant power calculated risk. German planners built their deepest, most heavily reinforced shelter directly beneath the seat of government in the capital most likely to be flattened from the air, a decision that proved entirely justified by 1945. Whilst the absence of any equivalent Allied structure reflects the simple fact that neither London nor Washington ever faced bombardment on a scale requiring 4 meters of overhead concrete. In this narrow sense, the Führerbunker stands as a grim monument to accurate threat assessment married to catastrophic strategic failure elsewhere. The historical impact of the bunker is, in many ways, inseparable from its final days. It was here, on April 29, 1945, that Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony conducted in the map room, and here, the following afternoon, that both took their own lives, Hitler by gunshot, Braun by cyanide poisoning, in a small study barely large enough for the sofa on which their bodies were found. Their remains were carried up the emergency exit stairwell into the ruined Chancellery garden, doused in petrol, and burned in a shell crater, a grimly improvised cremation conducted under continuing artillery fire, a final scene almost absurd in its combination of theatrical intent and desperate, undignified reality. What the bunker represents historically is not simply the site of a death, but a physical embodiment of the Third Reich's final delusion, the belief that sufficient concrete, sufficient depth, sufficient engineering could somehow insulate a criminal regime from consequences that were, by 1945, utterly inevitable. Soviet forces captured the site in early May 1945, and the complex was subsequently looted, partially demolished, and largely forgotten, deliberately so by East German authorities who feared it might become a site of neo-Nazi pilgrimage. Much of the structure was destroyed or buried beneath rubble during redevelopment in the 1950s and again after German reunification, and today the location, in what is now a residential area near Berlin's Potsdamer Platz, is marked only by a modest information board in a car park, a deliberate act of historical understatement that stands in stark contrast to the bunker's outsized role in the story of the war's end. The deliberate erasure of the site raises its own questions about how societies choose to remember, or deliberately forget, places associated with atrocity. East German authorities demolished remaining structural elements in the 1980s, specifically to prevent the location becoming a shrine, a decision later broadly endorsed by reunified Germany's own cultural authorities, who have generally favored understatement and historical education over physical preservation when it comes to sites intimately connected with Hitler personally. This stands in deliberate contrast to the treatment of concentration camp sites such as Auschwitz or Dachau, which have been preserved and open to the public specifically so their scale and horror cannot be denied or minimized. The bunker, by contrast, has been almost entirely erased from the physical landscape, a choice that reflects a considered judgment that some places are better remembered through documentation and education than through preservation that risks becoming inadvertent monument. Surviving elements of the original Reich Chancellery complex are scattered and largely inaccessible, Some ventilation shafts and fragments of concrete are believed to survive beneath later Cold War-era construction, though systematic archaeological investigation has been limited, partly for practical reasons and partly, one suspects, from a continuing reluctance to draw further attention to the site. So we return to that steel door, swinging shut in January 1945, sealing a war leader inside 4 meters of concrete built to outlast bombs, artillery, and time itself. It did outlast the bombs. It did not outlast the war. 12 meters of earth and reinforced concrete could shelter a man from the Royal Air Force, from Soviet artillery, from the physical instruments of his own destruction, but it could not shelter him from the consequences of the choices that had put him there. The Führerbunker was built to project permanence, to suggest that the Reich and the man who embodied it might endure whatever the sky above could throw at it. Instead, it became the smallest possible space in which the largest possible catastrophe could end, a concrete box beneath a ruined garden, the final address of a regime that had promised to last 1,000 years and lasted, in the end, 12. What began as a shelter against bombs became a tomb built years in advance by the very man who would need it, a monument not to survival, but to the precise moment survival stopped being the point.